do you, I suppose I'm saying to you, I'm asking you, do you see any hope? I know we've talked about this before, and if you did, where do you see it that we can somehow find it within ourselves to throw up and support good leaders, assuming we can find them?
I'm awfully sorry. I don't. I wish I could. And there's no pleasure in this admission. I look around and I don't see any reason to hope at all. I see a society which is in the course of tearing itself to pieces. And the things you mentioned, the complete unforgiving nature of politics when someone makes a mistake, the misery, in fact, which is increasing it. I think you can see why a lot of decent people won't go into public life, because it can tear you to pieces for no purpose, and private life is destroyed, and all kinds of other things happen, which must put off anybody thoughtful. Combined, as I say, with the fact that we just don't seem to be, our elite institutions no longer seem to be producing people who are prepared to do the thing which I think has sustained all civilized societies in history, producing people with the civil courage and the confidence in their knowledge and training and wisdom to say, actually, no prime minister, no Mr. Treasurer, this is not necessarily the right policy, and we haven't got that. So I just feel abandoned.
You know, I suspect that a lot of people do, Peter, and I'm making a process.
People say, why don't you go into politics? But how? I'm not as familiar with the system of politics in Australia as I am with that in my own country. But in my own country, here is the system. The political parties choose those candidates who will be selected to stand in parliamentary seats. They choose them in quite small groups. A lot of elite influence is exercised to make sure that certain people are chosen, and similar influence is exercised to make sure certain other people aren't. And I know that neither of the major political parties in this country would ever let me anywhere near a safe seat in Parliament. And if by any chance I managed to slip past their fences, submarine netting, and got in, I'd be on my own. And there's nothing more useless in the world than a lone member of Parliament in a Parliament dominated by whipped parties, who can reduce an individual to total insignificance. You might be able to make one speech of 4 minutes in 6 months.
Yeah, well, that comes back to the point.
You can't get in there. You have to conform. You have to conform to a certain set of ideas even to get in there.
So
same is true increasingly of civil service and public service, where the dominant ideology of equality and diversity is such that anybody who questions any of this is simply not recruited.
It seems to me that if there's one thing that's horrendously unsuited to the difficult policy choices that we'll have to make collectively if we're to have any way of finding our way out of this mess, it's this thing that might be called identity politics, where we club together with others with grievances, and instead of saying what can we do for our community or our country, we say we're owed, we're grieved, we need our government to look after us. It's a disastrous model in the circumstance where actually if we're to have any hope.
Yes, it's disastrous. It's disastrous, but it's a reasonable response among the people who do it, because they look at the way in which society is organized and they can see that if they want to get anything, then this is the way to get it, and it works. That's why it's not a. I don't think identity politics is a driver of this system. I think it's a consequence of this system. That's really pretty much the only sort of politics anyone could engage in to any effect.
Yeah. So in effect, a fractured society.
We created it. I don't so much blame the people who engage in it. I blame the people who've created a system in which it is successful and effective to behave like that, and unsuccessful and ineffective to behave in ways which might be more civilized.
And as part of this, we've torn down the standing of nearly every institution that undergirds Western freedom. So unless we can again establish some degree of regard and respect for those institutions, and that will be a two-way process. We have to be willing to respect them when they do well, but then they have to be worthy of that respect. If we can't break that cycle of distrust, then it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, because the reality is, one of the things that's happened now is that nations are back. Nationalism's back. Even in Italy, it wasn't to the World Health Organization that the Italians turned. It wasn't to Brussels, despite the common currency and the insistence that there be no borders. They turned to their own government, and that's been replicated everywhere.
Well, their own government promptly imprisoned them in their homes.
Well,
which I'm not sure is what anybody much wanted. I mean, Italians now, as a heartbreaking report on the BBC the other night, of Italians who are down to their last small change in their pockets, who's totally, it's a country in which there's an awful lot of small private business, and people just haven't got any money left after weeks and weeks of being confined to their homes, unable to work, unable to trade. They're just going broke. And what is the effects of this anyway? I mean, to get back to the COVID crisis, we have not at any point that I can see established any connection, either by correlation or let alone by causation, between these shutdowns of countries which are being engaged in so many places, and between any reduction in the number of deaths from the disease. I see no reason, looking at what one looks at the countries which have had outbreaks of the COVID-19 virus, from China to South Korea to Hong Kong, Singapore to Japan to the United States to Latin America to the European countries. You cannot see in any of them a pattern which in any way connects any action by government and any following result. People praise, for instance, both Hong Kong and Singapore for having acted promptly and effectively. In both places, the incidence of coronavirus went down after the actions that were taken. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the actions of Hong Kong and Singapore, they're different, and yet they had a similar result. So we have nothing to go on to say that this will even work on its own terms. And it just goes unquestioned. I get this all the time. There's a fascinating article which I'm tweeting pieces from in the National Review on April the 6th about Sweden, pointing out that it's the other countries which are engaging in the rash experiment, while Sweden is actually behaving as a normal country would be expected to do in a proportionate and cautious manner.
Well, I think it's said of the Swedes, isn't it, that they have a very strong understanding that what they call a good society can only continue while you have a strong economy. That it's a perspective.
I mean, I don't know what it is. There's a lot of reason behind it. I find it's slightly odd for me as a social and moral conservative to find myself standing up for what is basically a social democratic and politically liberal and secular country. But nonetheless, in this case, Sweden's educated elite seems to me to be behaving in a more rational, tolerant, and wise fashion than that of my own country, and I have to say so.
Now, to come back to the point that I was alluding to a moment ago, you're seeing again, I think, the rise of nationalism. That can be, if it's well done and there's a degree of solidarity around principles globally, nothing to be feared. In fact, in many ways, it can be welcomed. On the other hand, it could be very ugly. So in part, I'm thinking that America's capacity to lead on these sorts of issues has been anything but evident in this crisis, sadly.
Well, it's true. I'm not sure about this resurgence of nationalism thing. I'm not sure whether once the COVID-19 crisis has subsided, whether there really will be a real recrudescence of national sovereignty, for instance. Maybe of national sentiment, but the two things are different. I think some people, and one looks with considerable distaste at what's going on in Viktor Orban's Hungary, have used the event as an occasion to make further attacks on liberty and, in my view, the rule of law in their countries. And that's some people might also confuse that with nationalism. I tend towards patriotism rather than nationalism myself. Anyway, I think that the huge power of international organizations and of international regulation and of international trade will continue after this is over, and I'm not entirely convinced that this is going to change. The United States is under very poor leadership and has been for some time, and there doesn't seem to be any argument about that. Whether under a different president things will be any better, I'm not sure. But that's just a fact, and the United States is not and never will be again as strong as it was before the great folly of the Iraq War, which I think was the real moment at which its international influence began to decline in a really serious fashion. But this is just a fact of life which those of us who grew up with the United States as the great star in the constellation of international power have got to get used to. The United States is not what it was economically, politically, or indeed in any other way. And as a result, other darker stars begin to dominate the heavens. And we see a world in which China may become increasingly dominant, which I don't think any of us can really look forward to with much keen anticipation.
No, well, I suppose one of the aspects of this is that as we contemplate moving ahead when this is over, one of the things that many nations will be asking hard questions of their government about is how come we were dependent upon 80 or 90% in Australia's case and America's respectively for our pharmaceuticals, on China for our pharmaceuticals. They'll say, we have to set these things up here. We've got to be able to produce face masks. We have to be able to produce respirators, oxygen machines, and what have you. I think it will personally, and I'm just running this by you, set some limits on globalisation. I've always been very much in favour of opening up trade. I've always believed that it builds understanding. We'd always hope that, if you like, as China advanced down a more liberal path, it might see advances in its politics towards a more democratic state. That hasn't happened.
No.
For globalisation, I think it's a very interesting question, and it will require a lot of deftness, I think. Deftness, not deafness. That's
yeah.
what we don't want.
Just between the two. But yes, well, maybe. I think that the real problem is as it always is. People will take the trade policies which suit them at the time. When Britain was top nation and industrially immensely powerful, it was terribly in favour of free trade. As things got less successful, then less so. Australia, I think, has never been a major manufacturing economy, and is therefore has to have a different attitude to trade from one which has been. But I can't see how the levels of global trade which have been established in the past as what you might call the Deng Xiaoping era can now be gone back upon very easily. I don't see any sign of any great economic nationalism. And I said, political national sovereignty is increasingly extremely difficult to exercise, and often those countries which do exercise it have sanctions and other things visited on them. One country which I would love, I think, if it were allowed to be part of the international system, but because it isn't, at the moment pursues a sovereigntist position, is Russia. And both Russia and Iran are countries which are constantly the sanctions, isolation, and pressure of a diplomatic and a near military type to because they stand outside the globalist system, and I don't see any sign of that ending either. And of course, once all this has subsided and the economic crisis is over, will we again find ourselves with the terrifying tensions in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which still seem to me to be in grave danger of exploding into, at very, very least, a severe regional war, and perhaps one much wider than that, because of the way in which both Iran and Saudi Arabia have strong allies in elsewhere in the world. So I remain very frightened by that prospect.
Did you enjoy this episode? We cannot get good public policy out of a bad debate. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.